My name is Maggie Schubert. I am campaigns director at CURE. For those that aren't familiar with CURE, we are a rurally rooted organization that for over 30 years has worked to protect and restore resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of people who care about them. And I am joining you from far northern Minnesota. I'm in Ely from the delightful public library in Ely because the library here has far better internet than my home office. But that's a different infrastructure issue than we're going to be talking about today. So the topic for today, and we're really pleased that people could join us, is about how the clean energy transition and the build out of all this new energy infrastructure will impact rural communities. Which is a topic of growing salience across the country and in Minnesota. So to start off the bat, we just want to make it very clear that we at CURE are ardent supporters of the need to transition to clean and renewable energy. In our work around rural electric co-ops, we are actively bringing millions, if not billions of dollars of new clean energy to the state and the Midwest through the New Era program of the Inflation Reduction Act. But that's also why this reason of why and where and when we place and site all this new infrastructure is of such great importance to us. We are embedded in the communities that will, by and large, play host to all of the projects and the facilities. And this is going to dramatically and materially change the landscapes and the communities where many people live, have families, make homes, work, and provide the resources that all Minnesotans need and enjoy. And frankly, that reality does not seem to get the attention it should in a lot of discussions we have about the energy transition, except increasingly where rural denizens are increasingly being portrayed as part of the problem. And we think that's a real oversimplification of what's happening in rural places around clean energy. And so we really want to inform some of the discourse that is happening around this and thus inform some of sort of the policy responses that we're having to the clean energy transition. And that's why I'm really pleased to have our guest today, Dr. Sarah Mills, who's been doing some really great research and work in this area that has informed our thinking a great deal and really sort of opened up the range of opportunities and possibilities that we can have in this area. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Mills, who is the director of the Center for Empowering Communities at the University of Michigan's Graham Sustainability Institute. Her research looks at how renewable energy development impacts rural communities positively and negatively, disparate reactions of rural landowners to wind and solar projects, and how state and local policies facilitate or hinder renewable energy deployment. She's currently working on Department of Energy funded research projects, understanding the adoption of solar zoning ordinances, the economic impacts of solar on agricultural communities, and conducting a nationwide survey of solar farm neighbors. Through a grant from Michigan State Energy Office, she also helps communities in incorporating clean energy in their planning and zoning. Dr. Mills received her doctorate in urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan, where her dissertation looked at the intersection of farmland preservation and wind energy development. She has a master's in engineering from sustainable development from the University of Cambridge and a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Villanova. Sarah also serves on the City of Ann Arbor Planning Commission. So with that, I'm really pleased to be able to stop talking and pass this along to Sarah. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Maggie, for having me. I think I appropriately did screen sharing, so I'll dive in. And thank you for that introduction. I think now I consider myself, well, I am a city dweller because I'm on the City Planning Commission, but I grew up at the end of a dirt road. And when I try to explain my research overall, I really identify as a ruralist. And so I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about what an energy transition means for rural America. I should say that if anyone watching this or listening to this was at the State Legislative Leadership Foundation's Fall Summit last October, these slides will look very familiar because this is a hot topic across the country. And so I was asked to speak at their gathering. And so this is kind of an abbreviated version of what I presented there. So I would suggest to you that our energy future is rural. These are the maps of wind in gray and solar in yellow here, power plants across the country. And you can see they are not just concentrated in kind of where we have high population density, but kind of scattered throughout. This actually, I think, doesn't paint as much of a picture about how rural our energy future is as this data, which is a little bit harder to explain. So that's why I start with the map. This is drawn from one of my favorite papers that's recently been done on the topic of renewable energy siting. And what it's showing you is across here are the population density buckets of kind of counties across the country. And you can see in our lowest population density buckets, that's where we have 98% of wind development and 95%, I think it is, or maybe 92% of solar energy development. It's true that a lot of our fossil fuel generation is also in those rural places, but you can see that historically, it's been some of that generation has been in higher density environments. One of the questions that often comes up is why are developers looking for new sites for energy generation? You know, as coal plants or natural gas plants are closing, can we just, put wind or solar in those footprints? And the reality is we can't. This is the kind of footprint of a hypothetical 1,000 megawatt generation facility. And so for kind of traditional producers of electricity, natural gas, coal, or nuclear, that 100 megawatts would take about, or that 1,000 megawatts, sorry, would take about 100 acres. The same 1,000 megawatts of solar in the kind of a utility scale solar farm takes 50 to 100 times as much land. So again, you're going to have to expand beyond the footprint of that natural gas or coal-fired power plant. If we're talking about solar on roofs, that's not taking up any additional land, but there are challenges to rooftop solar in many states. And there also are some economies of scale. And so that's one of the trade-offs there. If we're looking at wind, the multiplier isn't that much different in terms of consumption of land for the generation facility. It's only 5 to 10 times what kind of a traditional power plant is. But you can't line wind turbines up cheek to jowl. The wind needs time to recuperate going from one to the other. So that 1,000 megawatts of a wind farm would likely span at least 100,000 acres with, wind turbines kind of scattered throughout that. We have lots of headlines like these. Renewables are booming. We hit a new wind generation record in 2022, and I'm sure 2023 too. This was just the prettier headline that I could grab. And there's a lot of federal activity driving investment to rural communities. But if you drive through rural Michigan, and I would imagine if you drive through some parts of rural Minnesota, you're also going to see signs like these to no wind turbines, no solar farms. This is particularly, interesting sign, grow crops, not wind turbines. This is from a project in Michigan. What I've spent the last dozen years studying is how to explain these different reactions. And so that's what I plan to share with you today. So there's a lot of great research on this, and my favorite paper is from Ben Hone and Joe Rand. Looking across kind of the literature for the last 30 years on wind energy acceptance. And what a lot of that research, plus new research that we're doing right now on solar, finds is that first, socioeconomic impacts of a proposed wind or solar project matter to how the community feels. So, and how individual community members feel. So a lot of focus is kind of on what is the lease model that a developer is using? Is it just paying the person with a turbine or solar panels on their property, or are there neighbor payments? this research finds that the taxes and the community benefits that developers pay is important to community acceptance. And there's also some work, actually some really interesting work out of Minnesota, finding that shared ownership, so kind of community solar farms or community wind, or when co-ops own the wind turbines, that there are that increases kind of community acceptance. Another strand of the literature, so process fairness, participation, and trust of both the regulators, local and state government officials, as well as of the developer, are really important to how people feel about the project overall. What some of my research has been, and some of this is also my observations from going to communities across the state of Michigan, which are being where wind or solar projects is proposed, adds some additional kind of findings about why we see different reactions to renewables projects. And I'll go over each of these in turn. So first, to be real clear, renewable energy is rural economic development. What my dissertation that got me the PhD was looking at is finding that people who have wind turbines on their property are using that revenue and reinvesting it in their farm. It's an opportunity to diversify their farm income, and it allows them to shore up succession plans. And when farmers are reinvesting that money in, their outbuildings and buying new equipment, again, that's recirculating in the local economy. There are stories, and I have I've interviewed people with solar panels on their property across the country, finding similar stories. But solar is a little bit tricky. Sometimes this is a farm diversification, but it can also pose some questions about conflict associated with tenant farming. And if this is a kind of a retirement strategy, how large-scale solar projects impact rural economy is something that we would need to talk about for another kind of 2 hours. So just to say that there's ongoing research kind of in this area. Getting back to the topic though, regardless of kind of how payments are structured or whether we're talking about wind and solar, across the country, renewables projects are also contributing community-wide to economic development through either paying taxes, property taxes, or some kind of replacement tax, or through direct donations made by developers to rural communities. Another finding from my research is that the fit of how well people think a renewable energy project fits in their community is really linked to why they live in that community. So these, again, are two kind of images from Michigan. Our Pure Michigan tourism campaign shows wind turbines on the horizon. And from Facebook, is this Pure Michigan to you, this industrialization of a landscape? This is where I have an academic paper with a colleague out of Michigan State University, where we looked at wind farms across 4 Great Lakes states, including in Minnesota. And what we found was some patterns. The title of this is Farmers versus Lakers. And so in places where there are lots of farmers, where wind is, where those landscapes are seen kind of more for their productive values, wind is often seen as another way to make revenue. By contrast, in places where there are lots of lakers or people there for natural amenities, USDA has a scale that you're higher natural amenities when you are not flat, so kind of rolling, and where you are closer to bodies of water. The places where people have cottages and cabins, that is where wind is more contentious. And I would imagine in Michigan, or in Minnesota, like in Michigan, we have lots of communities where we have farmers right next to lakers, and it's not just the Great Lakes, but those inland lakes that we have as well. And so oftentimes we have people who are living in that same community for different reasons, and so think about wind energy fitting in differently. Another finding from my research, and really that is just kind of driving a point home on what's found in a lot of the literature, about procedural justice and thinking about the importance of process is that transparency and opportunity for input is critical, not just in the short term, but it's also critical in the long term. So one of the things that I found with colleagues is that the process is not just the technical process that's written into the law or what's on the books, but community members think of the process as any interaction that they have with the local officials or the state regulators who are regulating the wind or solar farm, and also with the developers. So they think in terms of the sense of a fair process. For developers, they're thinking about whether or not there's a confidentiality agreement in a lease agreement, and also kind of bristling at this idea of developers going into communities and leasing up land first and then sorting out kind of the land use regulations later. On the local official or state official side, a summary of kind of how residents feel about the fairness of the process is whether opportunities for public input are just kind of a check the box, or if their input actually leads to meaningful changes in what the project looks like or the benefits that it might bring. I want to hammer this home a little bit. I do have a research paper on this, which effectively goes to people that live in wind farm communities a few years apart after the project was already constructed, to try to understand if, in like layperson's terms, people learn to live with wind turbines. What we find is that there are different experiences. People who felt the process was fair and had generally high positive attitudes about the project early on, and over time those attitudes stay the same or maybe even improve once kind of it just becomes part of their landscape. But by contrast, people who felt like the process to put those wind turbines in place weren't fair start out with a less positive attitude towards the wind farm that become actually more negative as time goes on. They grow, we write about in the paper, they become more embittered towards the process or towards the project. One of the new additions since I gave this talk in the fall is this right here, which comes from a National Academy of Sciences report that came out late in the fall. This is the nation's kind of leading scientists. I am not among them, but I am going to use their words, which is that research demonstrates that the character and quality of the process of engaging the public in the context of siting and permitting projects will affect the pace and scale of decarbonization. If permitting reform, which is happening kind of across the country, includes significant reductions in meaningful opportunities for and forms of public engagement, then such reform would create a real risk of slowing rather than hastening the process of building out a net zero infrastructure. The fourth learning that I've seen or takeaway is that bigger is not always better. So here's articles from the Department of Energy's talking about taller wind turbines, and they're saying bigger is better. And it's in the news about the Mammoth Solar Farm, which is in Indiana, which is 13,000 acres, being the largest in the country. And I'll say that in my travels in Michigan, I have never stood in front of a community that said, you know what would make this wind farm more acceptable? For taller turbines, or what would make us love solar better is more acres and solar panels. And so I think that that's countering this norm and increasing scale of these projects. Okay, so the next part is, so what might be done? Many states across the Midwest, including Minnesota, including Michigan, have clean energy standards or renewable portfolio standards, and I largely put them under the bucket of climate policy. But those policies don't self-implement. One of the things that I teach about here and that Maggie talked about in my introduction is that there's a web of state-level policies that either facilitate achieving our climate goals or that hinder them. And they include things like property tax policy and siting authority and our use of public lands. And so it's not just focusing on the one policy. to this idea that energy is rural economic development, as we are thinking about policy development across all of these domains, we really need to think about how this is going to hit in those rural communities that will host these wind and solar farms. So I think the question to ask is, does the policy reduce the local benefits? Does the policy itself polarize the issue because it's an unpopular policy in a rural place? And again, you need rural communities on board in order to achieve this energy transition. The really clear example is that federal style tax cuts don't work at the local level. Developers want and need to pay local taxes. And so if states want to incentivize renewable energy development, they can cut taxes, but only cut the taxes that don't stay local, and instead kind of move towards policies that increase tangible local benefits. One of the papers that I've written is about the invisibility of property tax revenue when it just kind of goes in local government's general funds. And actually, I point to Minnesota as an exemplar of something that is beneficial. The energy production tax allows for those revenues to be in a different pot so that people know exactly how much revenue generated at the local level is coming from wind and solar facilities. So I think that that's a clear example of this thinking, the kind of rural centric thinking. And I think that that's really great. In terms of kind of thinking into the future, I think that we need to start thinking about taxation of new technology. So as battery storage comes online, or if we're thinking about pipelines for hydrogen or something to that effect, because energy infrastructure is rural economic development, a key question that the communities that host this are going to be asking is, how am I going to economically benefit? And so thinking through the taxation of that's really important. To this idea that the fit of energy infrastructure is linked to why people live in that place, I think there's a couple of things that we could be thinking about. One is brownfield reuse. So in this nationwide survey of solar farm neighbors, most people say that the places where solar belongs are rooftops and on brownfields, old industrial sites. First of all, I think that we need to be careful that we're not assuming that people that have lived around an industrial site want that to always be a site of production. But many times this isn't a aesthetic improvement for them, and they would welcome the additional economic activity. Not assuming this, but asking and making supportive policies that make this possible, because again, there are some economies of scale. And so these smaller projects that might not be on the greenfields do need some support. That can be done through incentives, allowing for speedier review of brownfield sites, or support for smaller scale projects. And I would say that that could also extend to public brownfields, things in like land banks or marginal lands. Another kind of approach that is in keeping with this fit link to why you live there is thinking about extending transmission, not just to the windiest or sunniest places, but to the places that want this infrastructure. So effectively taking energy zone planning with a kind of farmers versus lakers in mind, and how do we extend transmission to the places where there are more farmers and fewer lakers. A great example of this is from the state of Texas, which through its PRES program extended transmission to allow access to wind resources in the best places across the state. To do that, it may require some state investment in the infrastructure to make that possible. Towards this idea that transparency and opportunity for input are critical to public acceptance, I'll say there is lots of move for permitting reform across the country, and I have serious qualms about state level siting. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, digging specifically into a research paper that looks at state level siting processes. At the same time, I think that process improvements are needed in many states, and more guardrails for local communities. One of the things that I think is important, regardless of kind of where siting authority right now, whether it's state or local governments that hold siting authority, is opportunities to get negative input early on before the project is fully cooked so that community members can actually shape the project. Another tangible step is asking developers how they have the project that they are proposing is responsive to the input that was received early on. My work with the state energy office for the last couple of years has been trying to get communities to proactively have a conversation about renewables, and many of them just quite honestly haven't. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is how to motivate a conversation before there's an emergency, how to get the community to be proactive. And one of the ideas is give them a deadline for action. This is a policy, effectively requiring all localities to come up with a plan, and all localities, not just rural governments, that allows them to take their fair share of energy infrastructure, is something that actually came out of a convening that we recently did with Clean Air Task Force. It's one of 4 ideas that we generated that were really paradigm shifting ways to speed up an energy transition, but without sacrificing justice and community input in the process. That deeper dive that I spoke of specifically on state level siting processes is from this paper that came out a couple of years ago that looked at two wind energy projects in states with state level siting processes, one in Ohio and one in Minnesota. Effectively, what they found is that there were a number of opportunities for improvements. And what I pulled out here was specifically the suggestions that they provided for policymakers. So, like I have said, getting public feedback earlier on in the development process, not once the project is fully cooked, but while the developer is still figuring out what the project ought to look like, especially from non-leaseholders. Those who would host energy infrastructure on their property have lots of access to and influence in the process, but their neighbors don't necessarily. Another suggestion that was given is to provide more resources for counties themselves to get good information and to be able to participate in state level processes. A key consideration in this is, and this is the quote from the paper, is move beyond adjudicatory hearings to more participatory decision-making processes. So again, something that involves more people and that is not simply a yes, no, but kind of working together to figure out how a project can gain community support and still get built. The paper identified the public needs information and assistance, not just during the construction phase, but also during the operational and decommissioning phases. After the leases are signed and once the project is approved, it's a done deal. And a lot of community members have felt like they're kind of left in the lurch and they don't know what's going on with the project. And also finding that in state level processes, there's an opportunity to address concerns about the impacts that a project would have on rural livelihoods, on landscapes, and specifically thinking about renters. To this idea that bigger is not always better, I think one of the things that would help ameliorate this is to have policies to take pressures off of gigantic projects. So expanding opportunities for distributed generation like rooftop solar, or for small solar farms on the distribution grid. So community solar, you have solar gardens in Minnesota, kind of expanding those programs. Further, I think that there's an opportunity to limit double standards, especially for small projects. So, and very often, state level processes kick in just on the biggest projects, which have the biggest local impacts. If instead we say, local governments, you have less control over super restrictive rooftop solar or backyard solar ordinances or small turbine rules, that's making more of an opportunity for those smaller installations that are not as controversial, which may alleviate some of the concern over the big projects. Similarly, something that can be done in this place is kind of limiting the opportunity for homeowners associations to kind of block these small scale installations. this doesn't fit into any of them, but I'm a ruralist, and one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is making the problem bigger. And actually, I think that there's a real opportunity in renewable energy. I say to communities, this is largely the biggest economic opportunity that you probably will see in decades. But I think that that works best when they consider it from their own perspective and come to that decision themselves. So it's a vision for having trusted entities lead proactive planning processes in communities, in rural communities, about how communities and goals and values are impacted by rural development options, not just energy infrastructure, but housing and manufacturing facilities. We need to do that in a kind of supportive policy context to inform better projects. This is something that I'm working with the Michigan's Office of Rural Prosperity here to do, but also have been trying to talk this up and get folks at USDA Rural Development involved, excited about this, because again, I think that there's a real opportunity now to kind of foster a sense of empowerment in our rural communities rather than have them kind of this just be the next thing that is kind of foisted upon them from folks in cities. Final slide with some closing thoughts that I say this a lot. All energy sources have trade-offs at the local level, every single one of them. And I think that as we're thinking about an energy transition, we need to be realistic and honest about what are the pros and what are the cons, and helping communities make sure that they are assessing those pros and cons fairly, and also doing what we can to ameliorate the cons. I also would suggest to you that this energy transition has an opportunity to expand urban-rural partnership rather than stoking the divide. But I do think that how state and federal leaders respond to local opposition towards renewable projects is really critical in deciding whether this is, if this is kind of joining forces or making that divide larger.